So hello, my name is Jeremy Collins. I'm the Director of Conferences and Symposia here at the National World War II Museum. And for today's wonderful conversation, we've asked our very own Dr. Jason Dawsey to moderate and lead the conversation. Jason is with us with his PhD from the University of Chicago. He's a research historian here at our institute, and he does many things, including our personal historic research services that helps families find out what their loved ones did during the war. But he also writes many of the articles that I'm sure you've enjoyed online, and basically, like most of us here, anything else the museum asks of it. So Jason, it's a pleasure to have you run this show, and now it's all yours.
Jeremy, thanks very much. Let me extend my welcome to everyone out there. We really appreciate you joining us today for this webinar on the aftermath of liberation, Jewish displaced persons in the American zone of occupation, 1945 to 1947. And it's really a great pleasure for me to have this conversation with my friend, Dr. Kira Crago-Schneider. So I want to give a kind of brief intro about her before we get into our conversation. Dr. Crago-Schneider is Campus Outreach Program Officer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She joined the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the Holocaust Museum in 2015 as a program officer working with students and faculty members throughout North America. So education has been a major focus of hers from the outset. She then became the Campus Outreach Program Officer in 2019 and does interdisciplinary work on the Holocaust relevant to unique geographical regions in the United States and Canada. She gets to do a lot of great traveling that I'm really envious of. Dr. Crago-Schneider works with colleges and university communities to develop and facilitate rigorous, nuanced conversations around important historical questions, ensuring that Holocaust studies remains at the center of campus and curricular discussions. I also want to note here that she is working on a book manuscript on the subject of our webinar today. So Kira, let me just say welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. And I've been looking forward to this discussion because it's rare that you get to come and deliver on a topic that you're really passionate about with a friend of yours who is equally passionate about the topic. So first of all, thank you, Jason, for the introduction and for helping to set this up. I would also like to thank the National World War II Museum for allowing me the space to come and talk to you guys today. I want to give a special thank you to Jeremy Collins and to Kaylee Martin, who are behind the scenes on this, but making the magic that is the internet work for us today so that you guys can all be part of this conversation. And finally, I want to thank everybody in the audience for coming today. This is a topic that I am very passionate about, but doesn't often get discussed. And I'm excited to share with you some of the things that I've learned and to hopefully answer any questions that you may have. So thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Kira. And we're here at the museum and at the Museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. We're delighted to be able to have a conversation like this. You're right, there's not enough attention focused on the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And we hope to be able to contribute something here today about helping our audience understand and make more sense of that. At least one aspect here, and obviously our topic is Jewish displaced persons in the American zone of occupation. And this is an immensely complex history, obviously, Kira, one that you're going to map out in your forthcoming monograph. So thinking about where to start, and maybe the place to start is knowledge in this. And what I mean here is about American political and military leaders did know during World War II about the mass murder of European Jews prior to the actual liberation of the Nazi camps. So this is a kind of two-part question to really get us started. When and what did they know about the camps? And then could you describe for our viewers the experience for American troops as they discover and liberate these camps?
That's a great question. So I actually want to back up to a point even before the U.S. had joined the Second World War, to note that Americans knew more than we let on that we knew. And what I mean by that is that already in the pre-war period, the Nazis had started to murder individuals that they argued were life unworthy of living. This was mainly people with mental and physical disabilities who basically their murder set the stage for what would later become the mass murder of Jews in the East. And a lot of the people involved in the murder of individuals with mental and physical disabilities were the same individuals who ran the gas chambers and the crematoria in the East. And the Reader's Digest actually ran an article about this before the war broke out. So we had some idea of the mechanisms that were being used by the Nazis, at least in terms of people with disabilities. But we knew in 1941 roughly what was happening with the individuals being persecuted by the Nazis. So here I do focus on Jewish Jewish victims, but I also am thinking about Sinti Roma, Slavic individuals who were considered what the Nazis called Untermenschen, or people that were below human. So we had an idea about the roundup of the Jews, their deportations, the ghettoization, and that they were ending up in concentration camps already in 41. Our intelligence knew in 1942, after the Wannsee conference that happened in Germany, that the Nazis had introduced a plan for the, quote, final solution of European Jewry, which meant the mass murder of Jews under Nazi and Allied control. And already by the spring of 1944, we had reports from American intelligence that noted that somewhere around 10,000 Jews were being murdered every day in Auschwitz. And that information, although it came in through the government, was something that was known by, was run in the presses and other such things. So there is information that is trickling out to the American people and coming from the government and military levels. But what we finally had confirmed reports and photographs in July 1944 when the Soviets liberated Majdanek, and they sent information from what they found as they liberated this concentration camp back to the US. That information became available to the press. So Life magazine ran a photo article. If you can just pull up the slide for me, please, Jeremy. You'll see a picture that is the crematoria with some, will you advance to the third slide, please? That's the crematoria and the bodies. These images were run as I said, in Life magazine, the LA Times, the Daily Worker in Los Angeles, and later the New York Times reported on this intel from the Soviets. There was some suspicion that perhaps the Soviets were building it up more than it actually was, in order to get more assistance from the other Western allies. But we knew, and that, like in the case of the Times, there's a whole book called Buried by the Times. But this is public knowledge. And everybody, you have to keep in mind, newspapers were like the vital news source at the time. People were reading morning and afternoon and evening editions, cover to cover. So people knew something about it, but it seemed still somehow unimaginable and couldn't be that bad. But for American troops, their first real confrontation or interaction with the Holocaust happened at liberation. And so many times when you read a frontline soldier who liberated concentration camps testimony, they will say that the first thing that told them they were in an area where something wrong was going on was when they were 1 to 2 miles from the camp, because the smells that really met them as they advanced. So not only the sweet smell of burning flesh, but also the smell of rotting flesh, or the extreme filth that permeated throughout the camp. And then when they entered the actual camp gates, most of them will talk about the piles of bodies and the skeletal figures that were walking around. And while the soldiers are sent to Europe to fight and to defend and to the end of the war, and they did all of this as soon as they came into the camps. They arrested those who needed to be arrested. If somebody was resisting or there was somebody hiding, they came in and they routed them out. But immediately, almost as if they did not have an order to do this, survivors, the liberating soldiers came to survivors and started taking care of their needs immediately. Now, keep in mind, these people are not social workers and they're not medical staff. So the way that they take care of them is that they are giving chocolate bars, they are giving cigarettes, they are providing their spare shirt, their spare trousers. Some of them are helping to move individuals that are totally immobile because they are so disease ridden and so starved that they can't move themselves, but they're moving them into lorries that take them then to field hospitals. So if you can advance the slide, please. You see in this picture that this is a chaplain who is struggling with an individual who cannot move himself, but he's actually trying to take him to a field hospital where he can be properly cared for. You have some soldiers who end up writing letters home on behalf of the victims. You have individuals that end up burying the bodies. And then you have Jewish chaplains that come in and say prayers over, say Kaddish basically for the individuals that are buried there. If you advance to the next slide, you can see this particular soldier has come in to hold the plasma bottle for a survivor that they are trying to save at a field hospital. So what we see is that really for these soldiers, and there are accounts of people coming into the camps and just vomiting because they are sensory overload of all of these different things. But once they get over that feeling, the majority of these frontline soldiers who liberate concentration camps come in as heroes. They really do their best. They feel extreme compassion, and they understand that they are interacting with like the most horrific form of inhumanity that anybody has ever seen in the world. And so these individuals end up in some ways becoming more like social workers than like soldiers, and that they have to find housing and clothing and food for these individuals when that wasn't their job and that's not their training, but they really stepped up and they did an excellent job at it.
Well, thank you for that, Keir. It gives us some insight about what these individuals, both inmates and liberators, the encounter they had under the worst circumstances in the spring of 1945. Before we go any further into this history, though, it may be worthwhile to consider the role of, really kind of consider two things: the role of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRA, its role in all of this, and for our audience to define the term displaced person, or DP, and how that category applied to Jewish inmates.
Okay, great. So the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, otherwise known as UNRA, was created in 1943, actually in November 9th, 1943, and was signed into being by 44 allied nations that agreed to help provide aid for countries that were devastated by the war. The second goal was to help care for until they could repatriate survivors that are liberated, survivors and refugees that are liberated throughout Europe. And UNRWA has the best intentions, and actually the allied governments are working separately and together to try and set up some platforms and some committees that can help UNRWA to facilitate the needs that they anticipate at the end of the war. They anticipate having a large refugee population. They don't realize that it's somewhere around 30 million. They anticipate that they will have somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 workers that will constitute teams of 13. Just in the occupation zones of Germany, Austria, and Italy. But in the end, when the war ends, they have 2,656 people. So they're largely understaffed. They have no training. One UNRWA director described her training as being talked to about displaced persons by a person who's never met a displaced person. So they really had no grasp of what they were going to be experiencing on the ground. And UNRWA was always meant to work with the Allied powers. So when you see UNRWA workers, they usually are wearing a uniform that mimics the uniform of a soldier, and they have to go through military channels for what they need and to make for decision making. But what ends up happening is that in Germany alone, they have 8 million refugees in front of them. And it's just clear. It's clear to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, which is the combined military governments of the various allies, that UNRWA cannot control this situation. They just can't. And so instead, the military governments in control of each occupation zone end up becoming responsible for the care and control and treatment of refugees and displaced persons. And UNRA and the Allies come up with a definition for what a displaced person was. So their official title is United Nations Displaced Persons, which is interesting because it's before the UN actually really exists. And they're just regularly known as DPs. And a refugee can be a DP, but it's not the reverse. Once you're a DP, you have a special category. It's a legal definition. That legal definition gets you certain privileges and better medical care and better rationing than a refugee would get. And before I give you the definition, I just want to point out that for the Allies and for UNRWA, the thought was that you would repatriate as quickly as possible and that everyone would want to go home. And that's not actually the reality on the ground. So you have individuals who refuse to go home or try to go home and then come back into Germany. But those people that are able to stay in Germany as UNDPs are individuals who have been forcefully removed from their homes by the Nazis, their allies, or countries that were actively working against the Allied powers. Individuals that were brought in for forced labor, that were POWs, and individuals who were persecuted because of their race or religion. So what that means is that most Jewish Holocaust survivors who end up being liberated end up automatically becoming DPs because their situation of displacement is based on their persecution by the Nazis and the Axis allies. And that's what differentiates them from refugees, right? They have to be individuals who didn't leave on their own. There's no question about why they're there. And if you actually advance to the next slide, I can give you, well, in just a second, I can give you an idea of who these individuals were. So as I said, UNRWA can't take control, but UNRWA supplements the Allied control. So these are a bunch of UNRWA workers. You can see that they're wearing military hats, that they are wearing military uniforms. Usually on the side it said UNRWA instead of US military. But they supplied with what supplies they could get from the 44 member nations. And then advance to the next slide. They provided medical care. They dealt with registration, and they dealt really strongly with repatriation. So in the case of Germany, in the first 4 months, they are able to resettle 7 million of the 8 million individuals who were considered refugees and DPs that were in the country. Now, if you'll advance one more slide, please. You can see that these are the individuals who qualified as UNDPs. So former inmates liberated in concentration camps, Holocaust survivors, foreign workers, slave laborers, and POWs. And those POWs were not, of course, American POWs or British POWs. They were POWs from Poland or the Soviet Union or wherever it was. The idea was that they would all go home. If you will please advance to the next slide, I can give you an idea of the last million. So if you look at this, what was known as the last million in Germany, you can see that the majority of them are not Jewish. In fact, there's only 50,000 Jews that are in Germany over the course of the summer months of 1945. As I note here, the number rose drastically between 250,000 to 300,000 Jews that were known as infiltrees. These are individuals who had either fled into the Soviet Union or been forced to move as the Soviets retreated. And they were finally released in 1946. All of the Jews, well, 2/3 of the Jewish population had attempted to return to their former homes, especially in search of surviving family members, only to find that they were often met by violent and sometimes murderous anti-Semitism, which then in one of the greatest ironies in history meant that they fled westward, seeking safe haven in the country of their former murderers and oppressors. And then there was a smattering of people from Yugoslavia, Slovakia, Hungary, and Eastern Europe. And those individuals, so we know that the Jews didn't return because of anti-Semitism, but the other individuals didn't return because they were afraid they may be tried as collaborators. And that was for even individuals who were POWs from the Soviet Union were afraid that they had heard rumor that when people got off of the train in the Soviet Union, they were immediately tried because they hadn't fought harder in the war and they'd allowed themselves to become POWs. And individuals who refused to go back and live in a communist nation. So all of these individuals ended up as United Nations Displaced Persons. And finally, in October of 1945, UNRWA is at an operational level where they can deal with these camps. So the Allies always keep control of the centers. They have ultimate control, but UNRWA begins actually running the centers. and doing the supplying, and they just have to answer to the Allies, in this case, the Americans. Oh, and so you guys are, and I think I defined what a DP was, but please, Jason, let me know if I did not.
No, that gives us a really good breakdown of the category and who falls under it, and the enormity of the tasks faced by UNRA and faced, in this case, by the American authorities in their occupation zone in Germany. And in fact, that's my follow-up question, Kira, is about the American presence. Here we certainly can say so much about this, but in your research, you distinguish between the frontline U.S. soldiers involved in liberation and then later waves of Americans who encountered the former inmates. So what is important to know about this distinction between the first and second waves or later waves? And then a figure that would be very well known to our audience, though not necessarily in this context, is what kind of example did General George S. Patton set in this immediate post-war moment with regard to the issue of DPs?
Yeah, those are great questions. So first of all, I think that it is important to note that the frontline soldiers had been actively fighting against the Nazis and Axis powers. They had lost comrades in battle. There are accounts that really illustrate there's no love lost between American soldiers and Germans. One newspaper account from the end of the war notes that the American soldier won't even give the German child a piece of gum. Because they've really experienced what this war is, and they've had devastating losses on their side. But they're also the ones who liberate the camps, so they automatically have empathetic and sympathetic feelings for the people who have been abused by National Socialists. And so, as I said, they really step up into this position and try to do their best to care for the individuals they now find under their control. But it's also important to notice that those individuals sometimes were anti-Semitic, more often than you'd probably think. And I just want to take a moment to note that the United States was anti-Semitic before and during the war. You can see this in some of the refugee policy throughout that entire period. Jews are not allowed to swim in certain pools. They can't join country clubs. There's redlining against Jews, so they can't live in certain neighborhoods. And they can't go to certain universities. So there's our own form of anti-Semitism happening in the US. And most non-Jews have really no contact with Jews. Unless they come from an area that has a large Jewish population, they've never met a Jew before in their life. And the only thing that they know about Jews are the stereotypes that have been put forward in their communities and by their families. Now, the frontline soldiers seem to mostly get beyond this, right? They don't differentiate between a Jew and a Pole and a Lithuanian. They're all victims of National Socialism. Now, that's not to say that there isn't any anti-Semitism. So, for example, Irving Haymont, who was in charge of the Lonsburg Displaced Persons Center, said that he would regularly hear his troops mumbling under their breath about Jewish animals, and that they didn't understand why they had to care for Jews when the Germans were actually trying to rebuild Germany. And this shows this total disconnect in understanding, because the Jews were not going to rebuild Germany. They were very clear about this. It was the Germans who owed the Jews something, not the other way around. And they would never have been rebuilding, and most of the people were too emaciated to actually do any hard labor. So this idea that the Germans at least work to rebuild the country and the Jews do nothing, or the Jews are these foreigners, it did exist. If you'll advance to the next slide, please. I think, as Jason said, Patton is a great example. We know him as a brave American soldier. We know him as a great strategist who helps us to get victory at the end of the war. But what many of you may not know is that he was a huge anti-Semite, and he was very open and vocal about it. It actually got him into a lot of trouble in the post-war period. And as you can see from this quote, this is from his personal journal, and it says, Harrison and his ilk, Harrison I will discuss in just a moment, believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to Jews who are lower than animals. So he had no feelings or commitments to displaced persons in general, but really not to Jews. And this was really problematic because he was the commander in Bavaria at the end of the post-war period. Bavaria had housed the largest Jewish displaced persons community in the American zones of occupation. And Patton's policy was to keep displaced persons behind barbed wire and behind armed military guards who had the order to shoot if they saw somebody trying to sneak out of the camp. You had to have written permission to leave the center, which made searching for family and getting food incredibly difficult. And the reasoning that Patton put forward was that if the DPs, especially the Jews, were allowed into German society and into the countryside, they would be a locust that would destroy the countryside. There would be theft, there would be crime, because he adhered to the belief that all Jews are inherently criminal, and that they had to stay behind barbed wire to protect the Germans. And so this person who's in this really influential position is protecting the enemy from the enemy's victim, because he has no feelings for Jews other than disdain. And what ends up happening is that Patton ends up being removed from his position in the fall of 1945, not just for his anti-Semitism, but also he openly questions denazification policies that the US is trying to put forward. And he's removed. And simultaneously, there are changes that will happen in the Harrison report, which I'll discuss in a moment, that you can't have an anti-Semite in this role anymore. They've really realized this is not a position for somebody who's not going to be sympathetic and understanding. But as he's being replaced, so too are the frontline soldiers. They've done their duty, they've done their tour, then they begin to be sent home. And what happens is that you get a new group of soldiers who have not seen the Germans as in their most horrible state. They have not lost comrades, and they didn't see the inhumanity perpetrated against the victims of National Socialism. And these individuals come in with their American anti-Semitism, which, as I said, is prevalent. And they start, the anti-fraternization law has been removed, and they start dating young, pretty healthy, accommodating Germans who act within society as Americans would understand people should act. And when they look at the people they're supposed to care for, they're very confused because, as I mentioned, food is in short supply even 4 months after the end of the war. The clothes that DPs receive are essentially one outfit, and it's an outfit that is used and not, it's like patchwork. It doesn't do anything to make them seem like they should be part of society. They've been trained through their Holocaust experiences that they actually have to navigate outside of societal norms in order to survive. They don't take orders very well, because when they had somebody in uniform before, it was a Nazi who was determining whether or not they lived or died. And they were often seen as very, very demanding. And you see this in the reports that come home from the replacement troops. Don't mean to offend anyone, but the troops that come in after. And those people take their blend of American anti-Semitism and they mix it with German Nazi anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism becomes quite prevalent among American troops. And so much so that there are documented violent acts that are perpetrated by American military officials. There are verbal attacks, and the American military actually has to start tracking through surveys the opinion of its own troops and creating educational courses that they hope will make the troops more sympathetic to the people they're meant to be caring for. And some of these reports are really frightening. In one report, I think that 40% of the respondents said that they, after a while of dealing with this situation, they now understood why Hitler might implement the final solution. So, you have these soldiers that they don't have any ties like the frontline soldiers did, and they only see the Jew through the lens that they brought with them and the German lens that is being lent by their girlfriends or the houses where they're living. And it really affects relationships and causes tension and hostility between Jewish DPs and the American military.
This issue about American perception of the victims is, I think, one we'll be dealing with at different points throughout this conversation, Kira. And you've already noted here this Harrison report from 1945. So could you tell us about this report and why it was so significant for American policy with respect to Jewish DPs?
Yeah, so the actual DP situation in the immediate post-war period has to be really understood within context. So we're specifically talking about Munich, but this is also true in Austria and in parts of Italy. I'm sorry, in Germany, Austria, and parts of Italy. But in the Bavaria area, they have had heavy aerial bombing at the end of the war. And so you sometimes have families, German families, that are living in an apartment that's missing 2 walls or the roof. You have families that are forced, generations that are forced to move in with one family member who's in the country because their housing has been totally destroyed. And there aren't, I mean, housing is a premium. And there aren't many facilities that can hold, at that time, 8 million refugees. And so the military goes out and tries to identify places that could potentially take part of these populations. And in some cases, it is at first proposed that the Jews will stay in their camp and that they will prove the camp conditions, which you can imagine is very traumatic for individuals who have been in those facilities. And this is the case in Bergen-Belsen under the British. They had initially thought that they could use Bergen-Belsen to help get people rehabilitated and then move them from there, but the camp itself was so disease-ridden that they had to burn it to the ground. And so when they were trying to figure out what they were going to do with the camp inhabitants, they decided to take over the Nazi barracks for the camp commanders right next door, and that became a displaced persons center. So a lot of people are being liberated and moved and housed in facilities where they've just basically spent a portion of their war experience, or they are being brought into facilities that had been used for Nazi munitions storage, or, we'll talk in a minute about a Hitler Youth camp. And the British and the Americans decide early on, despite the cries from Jewish survivors, that Jews will be identified by their former nationality, not as Jews. And the argument for that is that they don't want to categorize them as the Nazis had done. Really, especially for the British, it's a political move, because the British, by acknowledging Jews as a nationality, would have to then acknowledge that there needed to be a Jewish state, and holding the mandate and barely keeping control of the parties that were in mandatory Palestine. They decided that it was better just to keep the Jews identified by their former nationality. And so then what happened was that DPs were put into what are known as mixed camps. And that meant that you could have former collaborators or people who were huge anti-Semites housed right next to survivors in the same facilities, receiving the same care. And this, of course, was dangerous for Holocaust survivors. And it's interesting how the pattern played out, because if you had a Polish camp, the non-Jewish Poles formed an actual community, but they fully excluded the Jews from that community because the Jews they didn't consider them their former countrymen. And from the Jewish perspective, they had been stripped of their citizenship by both Nazis and Allied Axis powers. And so they didn't think to themselves, I'm a Pole, or I'm from Lithuania, or I'm from Estonia. They considered themselves stateless because they didn't have that citizenship. And in fact, in the post-war period, they still didn't have it in the immediate months and weeks that preceded. And so these Jews kept demanding that they be put in different centers. And, as I mentioned a couple of times now, food was it was a huge shortage. It was a terrible problem. The countryside had been destroyed, so you weren't going to be getting food resources from the local community as the Americans had imagined. Jews were forced to take what food they got in rations and to trade it on the black market, because oftentimes the food was not kosher. It was food that was foreign to them. They got no fresh meat or vegetables. And so they'd had to turn to Germans that had small gardens or farmers in order to exchange for the foods that they were more comfortable eating. And the situation was just really, really bad. And American Jewish soldiers, when they came home or when they sent letters home, started talking about the treatment of these individuals. And so what ends up happening is that this finally, it reaches Henry Morgenthau Jr., and he really pushes Truman to take note of it. And so if you can advance to the next slide, what ends up happening is that not necessarily Truman, but other divisions of the government, especially the War Refugee Board, decide that there has to be a commission to investigate these claims, and that the commission needs to pay special attention to stateless individuals, especially Jews. And the commission is led by Earl G. Harrison, and there are 4 people on the commission. So it's Harrison, who is he was a former member of the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, but he was also the dean of the Pennsylvania University Law School. And he's the lead. And then there is an individual from the HADC, there's someone from the War Refugee Board, and there's somebody from the Refugee Committee in the government. And originally they're sent over and they're supposed to look at the best camps, which often don't hold large Jewish populations. And instead, his itinerary essentially gets hijacked by a young chaplain named Abraham Klausner. He's really great. If you ever get a chance to read about him, he's a lot of fun. And Klausner ends up taking the commission to the worst camps where there are large Jewish populations. And right away, Harrison cables back to Morgenthau and says, all is confirmed. Everything that we have heard is confirmed. And in August, he sends over a report to Truman before it is released in the US, saying, I hope you will do something about this immediately. And the report is really fascinating. Scholars now understand that it was, that he kind of stretches his claims a little bit to make sure that people understand the real necessity for this. But as you can see here, Harrison said, as matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people seeing this are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy. And when Truman sees this report, he realizes he's got to take care of it immediately. So he actually assigns Eisenhower to come in and be in charge of it. And Eisenhower immediately starts implementing changes. So some of the changes that Harrison had put forth was, the biggest one is that he says there have to be 100,000 visas to Palestine. And the British immediately reject that one. But he also calls for Jews-only centers. He says that the American military needs to be removed from the camp and be replaced with Jewish police officers and firefighters, etc. He argues that Jews need their own camps. They can't be housed with other people, that they need better rations, and that because of their war experience, they need better medical care. And Eisenhower implements all of this immediately. So if we look at the next three slides, they're all examples of American soldiers who are in DP centers. So one of the big things that Eisenhower said was that officials need to be regularly visiting the camps and reporting back about any kind of problems, and that soldiers have to be able to requisition anything they need from outside communities in order to bring the standard of living in these DP centers up to the standard of that of the Germans. So Jeremy, if we can please just really quickly go through. So these are officials visiting the Lonsburg Displaced Persons camp after the Harrison report. And then there's one more image. And these are, you can see American soldiers. It's unknown whether this is DPs coming in or DPs coming out, but it shows the long-term involvement of the American military in these Jews-only displaced person centers.
This is really quite a turning point, this report. Carrie, you've kind of indicated here that there's something decisive about the issuing of this report and then the U.S. response to it. Did you want to elaborate and say more about conditions in these American-run centers?
Yes. So if you can please advance to the next slide, I would like to give everybody a few examples of what these DP centers look like. So this is the Lonsburg DP camp. It was a Jews-only facility. It was the largest one in the American zones. It was meant to house 4,000. It had somewhere around 6,000 individuals at any given time. And it's a series of villas, but it was actually a German military facility. And you can see that there's an area you can walk around, that people are out and about, but they basically live in barracks style housing, which meant that you had 14, 15 individuals in one room. None of them knew each other. The military decided that what was good for soldiers was good for survivors. So they basically got enough room for their bed. That was their personal space, but there was somebody on top of them in bunk beds. And there was really no room. There are no kitchens. This is basically just a sleeping facility. So if you could go to the next slide, please. This is Feldfing, which is another Jews-only displaced persons camp. It was formerly a Hitler Youth summer camp. You can tell that it has not really been cared for. And again, it is barrack-style living. Next slide, please. This is the mess hall at Lonsburg. As I said, it's not built for families or for cooking or anything like that. So you have a mess hall. You can see the very large and prominent American flag, and you can see some soldiers mixed in with displaced persons in the image. In order to create like a family type of environment, a Jew would have to be lucky enough to have found some kind of ramshackle table, and they would come into this mess hall and get the rations for their entire family and bring it back to the table so that they could recreate some kind of family setting. But most people, as you can see, came to the mess hall and just ate together. You can advance to the next one, please. I want to take 2 minutes, because I know it's getting towards Q&A time, to really quickly introduce you to the Fernvold Displaced Persons Center. Now, the other two camps that I talked to you about are some of 50 centers that are throughout American and British occupied Germany. These ones, as I said, they're all from outside of Munich, usually about a 20-25 mile ride from Munich, because that is where the majority of Jews were liberated in post-war Germany and are under American control. Now, and these camps continue to be active until 49, some of them until 52, but in Lonsburg's case, it continues to be active until 1957. So I just want you to take a moment to think about this. The war ends in 45, but there are still survivors living in Fernvold waiting to be accepted for a visa abroad in 1957. So they spend 12 years, sometimes it's 12 years of persecution and then 12 years of DP camp life. This picture we picked because it's in color, which you very rarely have in the from this period, but also this is the main supply and transport building. And you can see that it is in English. There is no German, there is no Yiddish. It is in English, which illustrates the control by the military and also UNRA, which is largely made up of Americans. If you'll go to the next picture, please. I wanted to get an aerial photo, but I couldn't find one that I had permissions to use. So this is the layout. It is like a village. And what I want to point out in this map, if you look closely, is that you can see all the streets are named after American states. So we have Michigan Street, there is a Wisconsin Street, Ohio Street, etc. Advance to the next slide, please. And what was so attractive about Fernvold was that it was actually built before the war to house laborers in the IG Farben factory nearby. And so each villa was made to accommodate several families, but to have their own private living quarters. And so initially, when it came to identifying places that would become Jews-only camps, the Americans did not consider Fernvold for Jews, because they said, well, we should give it to Poles that have intact families, or we should give it to whatever group it was that had children and things like that, which survivors didn't have. The first survivors, that first 50,000, were usually the only surviving member of their family. And so they ended up just, in the end, it was a huge fight, but they got Fernvold as a Jews-only camp. And it was a community that was protected by Jewish police, and people felt very, very secure. It housed 6 synagogues, it had a movie theater, a cafe, a dance hall, etc. And it was, overall, people talk about being a very pleasant place to live. Will you go to the next? I think there's one more slide. So Jason, do you want me to spend 2 minutes talking about camp life, or do you want to jump into questions?
I think we have a couple of minutes, Gary. Yeah, please.
Great. So while the first post-war DP camps were a mess and just really horrible for anyone who had to live in them, the Jews-only camps provided a safe haven where Jews could recreate community. And one of the first things that you have is hundreds of marriages. One DP described this by saying, I was alone, he was alone, we thought together we would be half as alone. And so you have marriages with people that have only just met, or people that knew each other 7 years earlier from the community when they were children, and now they're grown up and they meet and they marry. They have no family. There's a push to recreate families. And also they've been separated from the opposite sex for a very long time. So you see this huge push in marriages in an effort to rebuild the things that these individuals lost. Please go to the next image. So what comes out of marriage? You have a huge birth experience in the immediate post-war years. These are individuals who are babies and orphans together, but every single child that you see in this image was viewed by the community as an act of revenge against the Nazis. So again, in one of history's greatest ironies, Germany, which had parts of it that had been previously considered free from Jews, now had the highest birth rate, Jewish birth rate, anywhere in the world. And while Germans aren't having babies because their bodies are now in the post-war period emaciated, et cetera, their spouses are gone, the families are broken up. In the DP camps, everybody's having a baby, and they're having babies because they want to have the family part of it. They're also having babies because many of them know that they were experimented on in the concentration camps, and nobody was telling them what was being done to them. So a huge rumor spread that the women had been forcefully sterilized, and they wanted to make sure that they could have children, that their bodies were still functional. So you have all of these babies, and everyone looks very happy in this image, but I do want to remind people that the first women that are having these babies still continue to be pretty emaciated. And so they have to hire German nurses to come in and nurse their babies. They don't know how to care for small children because their aunts and their mothers and their grandmothers who would teach them how to do that are all dead. But despite that, they continue to have a lot of babies. Next slide, please. Another thing that is really important is religious life, and it happens almost immediately. Keep in mind that in the spring of 1945, as people are being liberated, it is Passover. So Passover pretty much aligns. And so people who have been liberated are invited by Jewish chaplains to come and participate in the Jewish American services. So you see this mixing of religious life right away. And this is actually a picture from a little bit later, but it's from Yom Kippur. And it's a mix of Jewish American soldiers and displaced persons together celebrating the break the fast at the end of Yom Kippur. Next slide, please. Education was vitally important, which is interesting because you didn't have a lot of children in that immediate post-war period, but they still fought for education for the children that they did have. And after the infiltree influx in 1946 and 47, you start to have more intact families. So more and more kids need to be schooled. They are mainly taught in Hebrew to prepare themselves for their future lives in the Jewish homeland. And their lessons are a lot of Jewish history and history about the Jews in Israel. Next slide. And as I mentioned, in Fernvold alone, there are 6 synagogues. So you could choose which approach to Judaism you preferred, but there were always services happening. So this is a memorial service, but you had your Shabbos service, and in Fernvold, the camp committee planned holiday celebrations that were open to everyone in the camp. Whether you wanted to participate or not, that was your choice, but there were holiday celebrations that were set up for everyone. Do you want me to keep going, Jason, or do you want me to?
I'm looking at our time, Kira. I was thinking that maybe this would be a good point, because I think some of the other things you described, you have some remarkable material about community, forms of community that developed that we can probably come back to in some of the questions, because we're getting questions in. So I think maybe this would be a good point to take a few of these, and we have one already that kind of points to what will happen later. This is from David. And he wanted to know about the process for Jewish DP securing a sponsor and relocating to the US or other receiving countries, how that worked.
Okay, that's a great question. So sometimes Jews would reach out to a sponsor, especially in the United States, that was a family member, sometimes a distant family member who had emigrated earlier. And they would just send a cold letter. And oftentimes, back then, even extended family was pretty well interlinked, and they kept up with conversations. And as American Jews learned about what had happened in the Holocaust, they were actively also trying to find surviving family members. But getting a sponsor was a big deal, because the sponsor had to agree to fund each DP for at least a year if they weren't able to find a job when they first arrived. And they had to provide a living space, and the whole responsibility for taking care of that person fell on the sponsor's shoulders. And so, people had to get a lot of documents together on their side to even act as a sponsor. And there were other cases where people would go into the American branch divisions and ask for the phone book. And they would just start calling people with the same last name and asking them, is this a relative? Is this a relative? Is this a relative? And there were some times when they called numbers and it turned out they weren't relatives, but the person said, you know what, I'll sponsor you. But getting a sponsor was really difficult. And in fact, immigrating in the first 3 years was almost impossible. You saw very little of it in the case of the United States. Truman was really pushing for Congress to come up with a bill that would be favorable for survivors, all survivors, not just Jews. And Congress was immobile until 1948. And actually, the Gallup polls from the period illustrated that the majority of people either wanted no refugees to come in, fewer refugees to come in, or to keep the quota at the same number with no exceptions. So there's a lot of pushback in countries that you'd think would have normally taken people. At the same time, the British borders are very closed because of the mandate that I mentioned. And you have huge numbers of people who are making illegal aliyah, which means that they are taking boats and rickety boats and other such things and going to Palestine, hoping that they will get across the blockades. This stops largely in late 1946 because the British have their own blockades, and they basically take the ships that are carrying these displaced persons to Palestine and reroute them to Cyprus, where they are interned. And so there aren't really borders that are open for Jews. And on the Jewish side, there's a whole process because the Jews didn't have any documentation. Their life was behind the slowly solidifying Iron Curtain, or the documentation had been destroyed because there was no need to keep it under the Nazis. And so they'd have to prove that they were individuals born in particular areas, that they had a clean history, that this was their war experience. And so it was really, really hard for a DP to even move on the process to start applying for immigration elsewhere.
Kira, thank you for that. I'm just going to mention, was watching our time here. We've got about 10 minutes. So this next one, you've kind of already hinted at it, issues about where can one go, what countries are open, what's really available, if in terms of leaving and resettling someplace else, which is going to raise a question about politics. Mm-hmm. And the kind of political perspectives, obviously, as Jewish DPs, as their bodies heal and they begin to be more active again, they're certainly going to have ideas about politics, about changing society, changing the world. And so what can we say about the kind of politics that emerge among these Jewish DPs in the immediate post-war years?
Yeah, so the predominant political push is Zionism. But within Zionism, there are all different branches. So there are branches that are for taking over Palestine and Jordan, the banks of Jordan. There are some that are arguing we need to work with the Palestinians to create a binational situation and to really build up the nation. There are some Jews that are, arguing that they'll take anything in terms of land in Palestine. And so these groups are fighting against each other, trying to get DPs to support their cause. But it's also important to remember that they're not the only political movement in the camps. So there's a large-ish Bundist, semi-communist organization that is active in the DP camps. And actually, when they run for political positions, they are attacked by the Zionists, physically attacked. But they still keep trying because their vision for the future is that it will be a socialist future where people can share and everybody gets what they need. And so there are all of these different political movements going on. But what you see and what comes to the front is Zionism. And when people look at the Zionism, they don't look at the different branches. They don't look at Jabotinsky's Zionism. They just look at Zionism as a push for a Jewish homeland. And the Americans actually, after the Harrison Report, support Jews going to Palestine and support a Jewish state, mainly because they don't want Jews coming to America. And this would take care of the DP population if they can just move them to Palestine. But the U.S. zone becomes especially attractive to new immigrants or to new DPs because they support a Jewish homeland. So this is a big thing. But within the camps, as the period goes on in 47 and beyond, without any kind of solution, you see regular protests where the entire camp community comes out and protests for a Jewish state in Palestine and protests against the British in both the American and the British zone.
That's really fascinating, Kieran. If in a different context, I would be very interested in hearing more about the Bund, because they have such an amazing history all their own. But a kind of a two-part question here about UNRWA. What actually happened to UNRWA and the DPs under its control, and what effect, what success did UNRWA have in reuniting surviving family members, families that had been torn apart by the war and genocide? Did they have much success in bringing about reunions?
So for the first part, within 2 years, UNRWA has spent all of the money that its 44 member nations have. They had not anticipated, as I mentioned, the DP situation continuing for so many years. And they had not really, some countries would send in what they could, which meant that they would send in 100 pounds of grain. And that doesn't buy other things. I mean, it provides food if it's processed and can be made into bread. But UNRWA finds itself bankrupt, essentially. And so it has a successor organization known as the IRO that takes over in late 46, 47. And the policy of the IRO is drastically different from the policy, in some terms, it's drastically different than the policy of UNRWA. So they reevaluate everybody who's in a DP center to see if they actually fit with the definition of a DP. So somebody who was a DP one day is not a DP the next day, and they have to appeal. But one of the major policy changes is that they are involved with resettlement, whereas UNRWA was involved with care. So they are still providing care, they're still providing outside resources, but they are largely helped up after August of 1945 by the American Jewish Joint Distribution, by HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the HIAS does a lot with immigration in conjunction with IRO. And so that policy slightly changes. And then the end of the story is that Jews continue, as I said, to be in camps in Germany until 1957. But in 1951, the Americans hand over control to the West German government. And that's like a whole other set of issues, because no Jewish DP wants to end up under people who were formerly Nazis, which is actually the case. In terms of reuniting family, that was really in the beginning a much more grassroots movement. So first of all, you had the International Tracing Bureau, where people are writing in. It's like a division, initially a division of the Red Cross, but people are writing in and saying, this is my family member from here, here, here. Have there been any requests for me? And it's basically a room with 1 million note cards where ladies are going through and trying to find any connection. But in the case of like the actual searches, there is a book that's created by Rabbi Abraham Klausner. It's originally handwritten, then becomes typed, and it's called the Sharit HaPleta, which is the name that many people use to discuss Jewish DPs in Germany. It means the surviving remnant. And he creates a book. He goes to different camps. He has everybody sign in where they are, where they're from, whatever it is. Then he takes that book to the next camp. And he does the same thing, but those people then can cross-reference to see if their family's at a different camp. And it ends up going into publication, and that's how family members are really finding each other. You have search boards that are happening in Poland that send people to the USDP camps, where it's just basically people will, when they come through to their hometown, realize that they can't stay, they go to the search bureau and they put their name and information and their destination, and then they leave. So there are like search mechanisms, but most of them are pretty grassroots.
It's really astonishing, Kira. You kind of pointed out how much we still need to know about this history is so fascinating and important. And so looking at our time here, we're right at just about noon Central Time. So let me thank you, Kira, for a superb conversation about Jewish DPs in the American zone. I think here at the museum, we've been wanting to do more programming regarding the immediate post-war, the legacy of liberation, and you've really contributed to that and helped us push that whole discussion forward. So thanks very much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank the audience for participating today. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, let me echo that to our audience. We really value you, and thank you for joining us again today, and hope we'll see you again very soon at more National World War II Museum events. Thank you.